face cuts in government funding, some families may be wondering how much they can afford to donate to charitable causes. There's going to be less government money for key services and for non-essential activities. So who's going to fill the gap? In the 19th century, rich men like Cadbury and Rowntree, inspired by their faith, used their wealth for charitable purposes. Can we look to a new generation of philanthropists to step up to the mark? In the United States, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are using their business skills and values to ensure that their investment in good causes is effective and achieves positive results. Could they provide a model for us in this country? Have we all got a moral duty to give? Joining me to discuss philanthropy are Rabbi Danny Rich, Chief Executive of Liberal Judaism, Jennifer Kavanagh, who's a Quaker and the author of The O of Home, and Richard Dean North, broadcaster and author of Rich is Beautiful, a very personal defence of mass affluence. Danny, give me a brief definition of philanthropy.
Well, philanthropy in Judaism has two aspects. One is what one might call the obligatory one, which everybody is required to do, and the other is the additional bits that anybody can do. So there's a minimum, which everybody's required, even the poorest, by the way. Even the poor are given money out of the charity box in order to give back a little bit of it, up to those who choose to give in addition.
Now, within your definition of philanthropy, if you give, do you have to give expecting nothing in return?
Yes, although if you don't give, you can be legally sanctioned. And there was an idea that you might not get a place in heaven if such a thing exists.
Now, Richard, I wonder, is that a realistic objective, to expect people to give wanting nothing in return?
Well, I suppose if you've got the rules, then you can get on with it as it were a condition of membership. There is just this duty. In our circumstances right now, I would say no. And I would say that people will self-congratulate even if you don't encourage them to. But on the whole, I would say that we should very publicly congratulate people who do good, especially actually if we don't think they think their reward is in heaven. I mean, after all, Christians used to be enjoined to be charitable because that was their service to God, and he might take it out on one in the afterlife if one had not performed. Now we're much more likely to need to find reasons right here, right now, that people would want to be charitable.
Jennifer, are you comfortable with the term philanthropy?
No, I can't say that I am. It's not a word that I use. For me, it has overtones of paternalism, of top-down, and tends to be used as if it was entirely about money, whereas I don't think it is.
Let's just turn to faith traditions, Danny, because Judaism has a term zedekah, which I always understood meant righteousness. Is there more to it than that?
It's tied up with the concept of just society. Expectations to give and expectations to receive are part of creating a just society. And I think that's quite an important beginning for where we go. I mean, in a theological sense, when you give, you're able to see, as it were, the face of God in the other person, because you bring them to a level of independence. The highest form of charity, according to the 12th century scholar Maimonides, was that you give people the independence that they don't need to rely on the charity box again. There's this idea that by giving, you're, in a sense, enhancing the individual in their own eyes and in your eyes. Poverty exists, people fall into poverty, and the just society tries to remove people from poverty as soon as practicable.
Richard?
Well, now, I have a problem with the idea of the just society, or more particularly the idea that one is giving charity or philanthropy out of social justice. I think the left invented socialism, if you like, as a way of enshrining the sense that the poor were poor because the rich were rich, and that it was an obligation on the rich to put that wrong right. Now, I dislike the mechanization, the industrialization, if you like, of philanthropy that socialism represents. I prefer the idea that charity and philanthropy should arise out of people's fellow feeling for one another, for that Christian thing of faith, hope and charity turns out to be interchangeable with love in the translation. I deprecate socialism because it mechanizes that process.
Well, I didn't suggest socialism was in the Hebrew Bible, though I might.
No.
There's a balance to be had between the two of them. One is that the community, in order to create the best community that it can, requires action on the part of everybody. And in addition, there are those who are able to give above and beyond what their duty requires them to do.
But there is a Christian theological understanding which says that all of our material possessions we have as stewards from God. They originally belonged to God, Jennifer.
Yes, but I was also agreeing with what Richard had to say about the mechanisation. For me, it is about love. It is from the heart. I don't think that it's about duty or about obligation. I think it is something to do with our interconnectedness as human beings.
Jennifer, how would you define the Quaker attitude towards material possessions?
It's very hard to generalise about Quakers, but we have what we call a testimony, that's a witness to simplicity, which I would define as removing the clutter between oneself and God, whatever that clutter is. And for some people, that is material possessions. I think personally that it's probably more to do with attachment to material possessions.
The idea of decluttering oneself is great, and I love that. But I do think that being really deeply engaged with the ordinary, the everyday, including the luxurious, is also delicious. And I'm not at all sure that it can't be really quite spiritual as well.
Danny?
I must say I incline towards Richard's view on this one.
I don't disagree either.
No, I don't. I think one should enjoy the material things in the world, but remember that, of course, wealth is tenuous. It might be our turn to be on the receiving end.
Christians have always been uneasy about money. The story about Jesus, the rich man, finding it harder to get into the kingdom of heaven than a camel to pass through the eye of a needle.
I think most people are still very uncomfortable with money.
Yes, I think Christianity, it's not for me to say in a way since I'm not a Christian, but I think it's in a bigger muddle about money even than it is about sex, and that's bad enough. I think philanthropy is very, very beautiful for both parties, giver and receiver, or ought to be, and it ought to be a very human business, and I think that it has extremely limited power to do good. So the Jewish sense that said, if I've understood Danny right, which is to say, put the person on their feet. Why socialism is tricky for me is that it seems to me to weaken people rather than put them on their feet. The problem is in the world is to make all those people who can stand on their own feet do so, and then to worry about what relationship fellow feeling requires you to have with what I think would be quite a small number of people who can't stand on their own 2 feet. Philanthropy has a bit to do with that, but philanthropy's power is quite weak compared to, let's say, the good that capitalism can do.
Philanthropy is very beautiful, and it is also powerful. And I don't think it's entirely about money. I think it is very much about support, about giving of time, giving of love.
Danny?
What concerns me, particularly under capitalism or socialism, is what do you do with the people that you don't love? I mean, it's all very well to say philanthropy is a gesture of love, but suppose I don't love the poor, suppose I think they're indolent, or some other method that makes me not consider them as human as me or as fortunate as me. I think one of the things about the Jewish concept is it says that everybody, including the poor, I want to make that very clear, including the poor, has an obligation to give a minima to the community chest in order to support those who are poor in other ways.
Richard?
The reason why I don't deprecate at all, but why I wonder about the Jewish way of thinking about this, is that it is, as it were, extremely communal, and to that extent not adequate to our very large societies. I'm very, very sceptical of the idea that somehow there is great fine-grained communal feeling available to us to use like there was, say, in the medieval period. I think that's gone, and we've got to get something sort of more grandly networked, and that puts philanthropy at some difficulty because it can't easily operate at the scale required.
Jennifer, let me refer back to a period of history when there were great English philanthropists, Rowntree and Cadbury, who made a considerable impact in English society. They were Quakers. I think they'd have called themselves Christians. I think of the United States, of Andrew Carnegie, people who had an enormous impact as philanthropists in their society, Jennifer. And it was Carnegie who said that he thought it would be a sin for anybody to die rich.
Yes, I'm rather tickled by the idea that there's nothing particularly good about leaving money when you know you can't take it with you anyway. So the important thing is to give it before you die. And I'd agree with that. I think that selfishly it gives you the chance to see the effects of your money, but why hang on to it? Yeah.
Richard, do you admire the 19th century philanthropists?
Yes, I do. And as I watch Ian Hislop's programme about several of them, of course, one's very touched. I don't think, though, looking at their example gives us much hope that the big society thing could now go in their wake. And I think we're going to have some sort of post-welfare system, and it won't look very like those pioneers. One way of looking at the way they were pioneers is to see that, let's say, Bernardo's is a big and important charity and was almost from the start. But I imagine it is dwarfed by the state or the local council system.
Jennifer?
The importance of philanthropy has always been and is now, and I don't want to understate how much is going on now. I think there's a huge amount going on now. It's just in a different way. And I think that philanthropy is about providing what the state can't. I think philanthropy is about an independence, about a willingness to research, to fund research in areas that government wouldn't, to be trailblazing, as you said, and to push the boundaries. And I think that's what philanthropy has always done. Rowntree, for instance, owned newspapers in order to influence things, and he was fundamentally about the source of poverty, about the reasons for it, and not just about giving in order to apply first aid.
Well, let me remind you that you're listening to Beyond Belief, and today we're discussing philanthropy. At a time of recession, with the state spending less on social provision, can charitable donations fill the gap? Hugely wealthy people, like Bill Gates, are giving vast sums to foundations which bear their names. Do they do any good? And is there any virtue in so publicly trumpeting the extent of your generosity? And with me are Danny Rich, who's Jewish, Jennifer Kavanagh, who's a Quaker, and Richard North, who believes in the virtue of affluence. Duncan Bannatyne has made a fortune. He's best known as one of the dragons on the very popular TV programme Dragon's Den. But he's declared his intention of giving away 95% of his wealth before he dies. He's already set up a number of charitable foundations, including Casa Bannatyne, a hospice for children suffering from HIV/AIDS in Romania. And it was during its opening that he had an encounter with God.
I went round the side of Casa Bannatyne and I was in floods of tears. I couldn't cope with it. And then I just felt a presence. I felt it was God. And he says to me, he says, join us, be a New Age Christian, be a nice person, do all the good things. And I just felt, no, I'm not ready. So I said no. And then the presence went away. And that was it. But I know ever since then that he's been looking after me.
In practical terms, what did saying no mean? What was the result of that decision?
The result was that I think that God understood me. He understood my reluctance and I didn't feel worthy.
What do your children think of your idea of giving away 95% of your wealth?
They're very cool with it. They don't mind. My oldest daughter is now married and she's married to a rugby player. She's very happy. My second oldest works and my youngest is my 9-year-old boy, Tom, who says, I don't need your money, Dad. I'm going to make my own money and I'm going to do very well, thank you.
Now, one of your charities that you founded, the one in Romania dealing with HIV/AIDS, carries your own name, Casa Bannatyne. Why did you decide to put your own name to it? Why did you decide not to just give anonymously?
I didn't. When it was opened, I got a surprise. I turned up and they had called it Casa Bannatyne. It wasn't my idea.
Do you think it was a good idea?
I think it was a great idea, actually, because it allows me to talk about my philanthropy and talk to other people about it. I found when I've started to investigate how rich people give and don't give, that a lot of the ones who don't give anything say, I keep my giving secret, but secretly they're not giving anything. And I think that by talking about it, it helps me to convince other people to give. So I'm cool with it. And I don't mind people criticising me for the fact that I talk about what I give all the time and I list it actually on my website, because I'm going to continue to do that because I think it helps a lot more people to give as well.
Presumably it's very important to you that your charities are run on business principles, that there's proper accounting, that you've got a projected business plan, that you know what's going on, that it's run well.
Yeah, the orphanage was a great example, Casa Bannatyne, because it cost me $40,000 each year. So for the last 12 years, I've just paid $40,000 a year for the maintenance of it and the upkeep of it, and it runs very well. But it's probably costing a little bit more than that now, but I've told them they've got to take responsibility. So they're actually raising funds in Romania with businesses in Romania and taking over some of the cost of running it. It sort of gives the onus back on them, because you can't continually to just fund something charity-wise forever, or the country becomes reliant on it.
I'm wondering how tightly you supervise the accounts. Do you expect them to be providing you with some sort of charitable return on a consistent basis?
Yeah, absolutely. I visit the Casa Bannatyne each year, and everything else I'm involved in, I always look at it. I've just spent actually a week in Bolivia, with UNICEF because I wanted to see how we could meet the Millennium Goals, which is to ensure that all children have access to clean water and adequate toilet conditions, because 85% of children in Bolivia who die as infants die from diarrhea-related illnesses, which is because there's no clean water and no toilets. For £350 we can install a water pump in a village halfway up the Amazon basin. It's fantastic.
Is that another positive reason for the organisation carrying your name? Because you are a brand. If anything goes wrong with the organisation, it reflects badly on you, so you've got a personal interest in making it work.
Yeah, I think it is. And also, I came back from Bolivia and I went straight to UNICEF fundraising ball, and I was able to stand on the stage and I was able to speak about what happened and tell them we raised a lot of money. It was fantastic. If it wasn't a known name, you couldn't do that sort of thing.
Do you think poverty is in any way more virtuous than having lots of money?
I don't think either is virtuous. I think living a good life and doing your best is virtuous, and doing whatever you can and being proud of your life and being proud of yourself.
That was Duncan Bannatyne, who's a new philanthropist, a wealthy capitalist who's putting his money to good use. I assume you must approve of him, Richard.
Oh, yes. Of course I do, partly because he's made himself happy, he's making other people happy, he's not overclaiming the good that he's doing. There's no harm in all that at all, and there is some good. I should say that I don't think that people who are rich have to be philanthropic in order to somehow redeem themselves or absolve themselves, as though what they were doing in becoming rich was wrong. I mean, it is possible to argue reasonably that somebody like Bill Gates might have been an even greater force for good if he had made Microsoft more interesting in some way that I don't have to specify. And indeed, it isn't at all clear that a person doesn't do a great deal of good merely by buying a large white yacht or reinvesting his money in firms. I strongly deprecate the idea that being rich is wrong and being wrong is somehow especially absolved by charity.
Danny?
Well, no one's suggesting that being rich is wrong, I don't think. What one is saying is that every person has an obligation to give. Clearly, if you've got more, it seems to me, you should be incentivised to give in all sorts of ways.
What sort of ways?
The taxation system would be one, where the charities could benefit more greatly rather than the exchequer. There is no doubt, much as Maimonides says that the most important way of giving is to do so anonymously, we do know that one person giving and saying they're giving encourages others to do so. Human beings are by nature, they like to do things together. And so if X is prepared to say I'm putting Y amount of pounds into this charity, the likelihood that his or her mates will follow.
So do we believe that it's actually a good thing that he doesn't remain anonymous, Jennifer?
I have mixed feelings about it, I suppose. I think it does encourage other people, but I think going into great detail about what one's doing is a matter of ego rather than about encouraging other people.
But ego is good in itself. One has to gratify it somehow. I like the idea that we have a sensible society which says, wow, good on him. But there is also the interesting thing that, as he identifies, that he's put his name on this thing and its faults will be going to him as well. I mean, one of the problems with philanthropy, if you like, is that it is quite often rather unaccountable, can do a great deal of activity in perhaps rather a small area and might do harm. At least here, what he does is going to come right back to him, and that's good as well as he's been praised.
I agree with you that philanthropy and charitable giving has to be accountable to trustees and to individuals who give. If you build a theatre, if your name is associated with it, and actually that helps build the theatre because otherwise you could only afford half the theatre, there seems to be some benefit in that. The question is, however, does that become somebody's motive? If their motive is to have their name up in lights, then I just consider that mildly, or more than mildly, self-indulgent. But if their motive is to share art or provide water for individuals, those seem to me to be the motives that one ought to be talking about.
But I suppose what I'm saying here is that I'm feeling very cavalier and not Puritan about this matter. Tick the box. Does this add to the gaiety of nations? If a man giving a lot of money and holding a dinner and putting his name on the theatre, so it all adds to the gaiety of nations, including our knowledge that he's vain. I mean, it's all good fun and it's real and it's affectionate. Whereas if we go around with a long face and say, well, not only should you not be celebrating this, you should have done
done it out of a deep sense of duty because you've made the world a miserable place.
No, duty doesn't have to be
in the end, we
miserable.
all tail off into a sort of dreary accountability thing.
He may be a lot more
happy.
vain as a result of it all. Jennifer?
Joy and celebration are part of what life is about. I couldn't agree more. I would take issue, however, about wealth. I think money is neither good nor bad. It's a tool, and if used in the right way, it can be a force for good. However, it has been shown that societies where there is a great deal of wealth, beyond needs having been fulfilled, does not make for greater happiness. What makes for great unhappiness is great inequality within a country, between countries and within countries.
Now, all that stuff is pretty good nonsense. Wealth seems rather well correlated with well-being.
It's a very long argument, and it's another programme entirely, but I do want to ask you this. Do you think that philanthropy, to be virtuous, maybe you don't think it has to be virtuous, but if philanthropy has to be virtuous, does it have to cost you? You know, I wonder in total terms, is all that he's doing costing Bill Gates? Is it costing Duncan Bannatyne? And does it matter?
Well, I suppose to be philanthropic is to give, whether or not one's giving one's time or one's energy or one's money. So in some real sense, it is definitely an act of giving, and it ought to cost you.
But it's a two-way process. It's not about one person giving and one person receiving. In the giving, one receives. There is no question about that.
Quite, but it's a two-way thing. You've still got to do the giving. You
also
will
need
gain.
to feel it a bit, I think, don't you?
Yeah.
I mean, I once had a campaign in my own community where I said, you know, if you don't feel what you're giving, then you need to give a bit more. In other words, you have to notice that you've given it.
Sounds like a good sales pitch to me, Danny.
No, but it's also true of virtue. I mean, virtue has no meaning unless it involves a bit of suffering. And it's a bit like gambling, too. Gambling's no good unless it is really quite risky. You haven't sort of entered into the spirit of the thing.
One of the reasons that Duncan Bannatyne had for giving away his money, I suspect, was that he didn't want to burden his children with too much money. He felt, in a sense, that for them to start their lives with bucketfuls of money was not good.
He's going to leave them 5% of it, so we don't know what 5%... You see, if I leave my kids 5% of what I get left with, they won't get very much. I might suggest that in the case of this man's children, 5% might be a little bit more.
No, but he wants them to strive. He wants them to have to strive.
I'm a bit worried about that. I think it is quite right for a father to advertise to his children that he's going to leave them nothing. I think that's good. One ought to keep a little strength reserved for the good one has to do or may have to do one's own family rather than the wider world. But I think,
but maybe it's better to give it to them while you're alive and you can see them spend it or fritter it.
yes, but not when they're young. Tell them you're
When
not...
they're 37, you mean?
You have to tell a white lie. You have to tell your children they're going to get nothing from you on the basis that that will make them strong. If it turns out that they're absolutely lovely but no good at making money, it might have been a good idea to have some in your back pocket to help them.
What do we make of one of the fundamental principles of new philanthropy? This idea that you apply business principles to it. Jennifer?
I think there are two things. I think there are occasions when pure giving from the heart is essential. When you're dealing with health, when you're dealing with children, I think it's also very important to empower people to be independent, to give them the self-esteem and the hope of being able to stand on their own feet. I think that's very important.
You should run your charity with business disciplines. In other words, it shouldn't be wasteful. There's no point supporting a project that clearly isn't going to meet its objectives. Those are types of business disciplines.
If the state gives provision to meet the social needs of a wide variety of people, there's a sense in which it is relatively even-handed. When somebody like Bill Gates or even Duncan Bannatyne sets up a foundation, they lay down the criteria. They decide what's going to be given. And there's bound to be an element of imbalance in that.
Yes, you're quite right. And I suppose the obvious way of looking at it is that private charities find certain sorts of causes attractive. In the medical field, certain illnesses attractive and certain others aren't. And to some extent, the state has an obligation to find the unattractive illnesses and the unattractive, the undeserving.
I think my point about the philanthropists, the new philanthropists, is that it puts enormous power into their hands. And these are people who are inevitably powerful people originally.
I must say, the trustees that I work with, the philanthropists I work with, they're very keen that I should report to them what I'm doing, that they should have some general sense, but I find them very responsible and non-interventionist in the sense of abusing their power.
And if you look at the really big players like the Gates Foundation, big as it is, and potentially, as it were, monomanic as it might be, it turns out that pretty capable of withstanding attention. I mean, it's good enough to be looked at. I'm not unduly worried about the problem of private philanthropy. I'm not sceptical on grounds that it's not any good. I just don't think it's ever going to be as big as the scale of the problems we want to solve are.
One of the very impressive things about Duncan Bannatyne's interview to me was the fact that he's visiting these places.
Yes,
he's
absolutely.
going there. He's listening to the people on the ground.
And Rowntree insisted on support. His trusts that exist to this day are very much about support, ongoing support and interest in the organisations that they fund. It's not just about money.
If we turn to America, it has a much smaller welfare state than we do, and I find it significant that that's the place where these new philanthropists, by and large, are coming out of. America needs more private philanthropy than we do because it's got a less of a welfare state. Richard?
Yes, and I imagine we're going to become rather more American, not least perhaps in making the same sort of tax arrangements which encourage philanthropy, and probably in the attitude about self-congratulation will go that way as well. All fine. But the American example, I think, shows you the problem with philanthropy.
You're not keen on the state, you're not keen on philanthropy, you're cynical about community. What's left to do this work?
Well, I thank you for asking. I think what it will be is the market, low-profit organisations, cooperatives, I think all kinds of things where actually a buck is being turned will turn out to be extremely valuable successors to the old philanthropies and to the old mutual aid organisations.
So do we think we're going to have more Duncan Bannatynes in this country?
Yes.
Yes, I think we are.
I think there are many of them in much smaller dimensions. There are lots of people living those kinds of lives who've got less to start with but are still giving a great deal of what they have.
We must draw this programme to a close, so I'd like to ask each one of you a final question. If you hit hard times, would you be happy to receive help from a wealthy philanthropist, Jennifer?
I think it's very difficult to receive, sometimes harder than to give, but sometimes pride gets in the way. I would hope that I would, but I would certainly prefer it if I knew the person concerned.
Richard?
I'm a very good receiver, and impecunious writers have from time to time, thank goodness, been bailed out by rich people in extremis. I stand ready.
Danny?
I would see it as my right to be assisted such that I wouldn't require the philanthropist in the future.
Well, there we must leave it. My thanks to Richard D. North, Jennifer Kavanagh and Danny Rich. I'll be back at the same time next week when I hope you'll join me.